I believe that this book shows through a logical deduction that nihilism is impossible for human beings and we should stop acting like it is. And so Mr. Samuel Barnes begins in the preface of his Missing Axioms 2021, which was released. You should certainly find yourself a copy. It is a philosophy for disorientation. Very often when you read a philosophical text, it feels like you have to choose between elegant prose and insight. If you open a copy of Kant or Derrida, you might have to just sort of forgive the prose and sort of just tell yourself there's a lot of insight to be found here, and therefore you stick with it. But Missing Axioms is a joy to read. The sentences are well constructed. They have a beautiful music to them, lots of unforgettable turns of phrases, and not only are the sentences elegant and well constructed, but it's precisely because of the turn of phrase that the ideas can be easier to remember and to understand. He has this point where he points out that we don't really choose the fact that we have experience. We're just thrown into it, to use that Heideggerian language. And he has this line where he says, experience affirms itself by virtue of its having content. It is that which lies beyond, which opens the possibility to nullification. And just that idea there, experience affirms itself by virtue of its having content, is one that I'll remember because it's so well put on the idea that it's just the very fact that we have experiences that seem to suggest that they are valid. And it's just a very nice way to put it. And also this other line where he's talking about how we can't escape values, where he says the human truth is that you have values which emanate from you explicitly and implicitly. Values spew from us in every stride or stumble. I just love that. The idea is that values are spraying from us in every stride, yet spewing from us in every stride. That's an unforgettable line. And that, I think, brings us to the beginning arguments of the book. Now, I'm certainly not going to trace out the entire book. You're going to have to read it, but there are a few I think that are fun to point out. So that are a good starting point. He begins the collection really asking, what is nihilism? And is it possible to actually live as a nihilist? And obviously a classical understanding of a nihilist is someone who believes in nothing. But he points out that it's actually not possible to show nihilism, only to tell it. So I'm a fiction writer, so that's the language I like to use. He uses the language of explicit versus implicit. You see, if maybe as you don't believe in anything, and so you lay in bed all day. But the fact you lay in bed all day does not necessarily mean you are a nihilist. I could interpret it as you resting up or that you're just tired. I don't necessarily have to interpret your action as meaning that you believe that life isn't worth living. And also there's this irony that he points out that if you tried to die for nihilism, the very fact that you died for nihilism would suggest that you think there's something worth dying for, ergo nihilism. And that in of itself would sort of suggest that nihilism is not true. So there's this quandary here that makes it really hard to believe. Well, it makes it impossible for human beings to live as a nihilist. And yet at the same time, Mr. Barnes is not suggesting that nihilism contains no truth content, that instead what he wants us, it's not necessarily saying that there are Platonic forms out there or a heavenly realm, but he is pointing out that it's not possible to live as a nihilist. So instead, what he would like us to live as is someone who accepts a problem of missing axioms, which is the fact that even if we believe in nihilism, we can't actually live like a nihilism. So there's this sort of disorientation that this creates. But you see, for Mr. Barnes, the philosopher is someone who lives and wrestles with disorientation and learns to live with it. And what Mr. Barnes would like us to do is learn to live philosophically as opposed to living like a nihilist. Because really, one could say, well, what's the harm, in calling oneself or trying to live like a nihilist, even if it's not ultimately possible? And it would seem to me that there can be quite a bit of harm because then what comes to mind, there was recently with indie thinkers a class on Leo Strauss, and he has this famous work on German nihilism where Leo Strauss kind of points out that the German nihilist is not so much someone who believes in nothing. That's not what Strauss means by German nihilism. What he recognizes is it's more of a spirit of we're going to have traditional values, we're going to have this sort of, even dare I say in their minds, heroic life, or we'll have nothing at all. It's either going to be a grand life according to the Nazi party, or it's not going to be any life at all. So what ends up happening is nihilism is a sort of extremism where it rather prevail or burn everything down. But you see, if we think that nihilism is a belief in nothing as opposed to something more akin to the the Japanese kamikaze fighter, and he has a section on the Japanese that is fantastic. Well, if we make that misdiagnosis, we may fail to realize the ways in which trying to live nihilistic or misdiagnosing nihilism can manifest in nationalism, in religious fanaticism, or other great problems. So it's not, for Mr. Barnes, as I understand it, harmless to make the mistake of believing nihilism is possible. It's going to manifest in some very problematic ways, and it will probably be captured by power structures to do its bidding. And he's going to go on and talk about some problems you see in religion and some problems you see in nationalism. Also, too, if we take nihilism off the table, we are forced to confront the disorientation of our lives, and this is going to also force us to sort of to answer and to sort of live a higher ideal. And he makes an example of Socrates, who is someone who he makes this wonderful idea where he says an authentic martyrdom in contrast to the fanatic sacrifice which arises from ideological possession is the emergence of conviction in a lifelong project. And I think for Mr. Barnes, that idea is what we see in Socrates. And Socrates is someone who is going to be more of a personification of living according to missing axioms as opposed to nihilism. And now the challenge, of course, is that if we take seriously this argument that we have to live in concordance with missing axioms as opposed to nihilism, then everyone must learn to be philosophical. They must learn to exist in a state of existential anxiety that doesn't give over into simple solutions that perhaps some totalitarian dictator could present. But Mr. Barnes is no idealist. He's not going to gloss over the difficulties of this, because the philosopher is also someone who might realize that it's caves all the way up, for example, or that we're stuck in a sort of Baudrillard's simulacry. And there's this kind of narrative from Plato that the philosopher is someone who comes out of the cave into the light. But it could be possible, Mr. Barnes suggests, that it's just caves all the way out, that the philosopher never comes out into the light. And yet, all the same, we must learn to live as an individual who is still striving, who is still trying to be authentic, who accepts the possibility that it might be caves all the way up. Now, of course, it could be a challenge to convince people to live this way. And also, too, you see, another reason, before I forget, that I think Mr. Barnes wants to suggest that we have to avoid nihilism is precisely because we are social creatures. We're always going to live in a city unless we're a beast or a god, according to Aristotle. Then our attempts to be nihilist are ultimately probably going to be captured by the social structure around us. And that's another reason why it's very important, because we can't live as a sort of isolated philosopher. And I bring this up as well because it's important to realize that for Barnes, the philosopher is not someone who exists outside of society, because that would be too easy, but learns to live in society, comfortable with disorientation, without giving into simple solutions, like turning over to nationalism or even suicide or things like that. There's a lot more to the book. It's going to outline an extraordinary history on Japan. It's going to discuss Christianity. It's going to discuss some of the questions, like I said, of Plato's Republic. It will have very interesting sections on the question of suicide and different things like that. But it is very difficult to find new philosophical ideas. And Mr. Barnes recently released a piece where he's making a point to call himself a philosopher. And he points out how in society today, if you call yourself an entrepreneur, you're met with praise. You're met with glory. But if you call yourself a philosopher who has stepped outside of academia in order to escape the restraints so that they can do their own work, you can be scoffed at. And there's a sort of bravery that Mr. Barnes exhibits, and saying quite clearly and unabashedly that he is going to do philosophical work outside of academia, because that can be so laughed at. But no one should be laughing at Mr. Barnes after releasing a book like this. It is the beginning of a wonderful life of thought. No doubt there will be many more wonderful children that will be birthed forth from Mr. Barnes' mind, and you will appreciate it and you will enjoy it, and it will really, I think, very well articulate the questions that we today need to confront and to live with, in accepting the reality that our lives are missing axioms. And so the question is now, what will we do with that problem? And Mr. Barnes has given us a wonderful guideline.